Interface design is everywhere. From the website you visit to the phone you're probably watching this on right now. UI and UX are some of the most important elements in any design, and if they're really good, you'll never notice them. But what happens when a video game doesn't have UI? How do you know where you're going? How do you know what you can interact with? And why do I think these two games are pretty much the same? You're about to find out. That's right, making you watch the entire video. You'll enjoy it though. Stray was developed by Blue 12 Studio and was in development for about 7 years, and those 7 years were spent well, my friends. Let's talk about the game itself, because you notice something. There was almost no interface, especially in the beginning of the game. No map, no waypoint, no life bar, no names. You'll get a prompt, but that's it. But here's the thing, the game was designed from the ground up for minimal interface. Okay, wait. While I'm not going into story, I will be showing off mechanics and parts of the games that have a lot of spoilery context around it. So if you haven't played it yet or you plan to play it, you might want to hold off on this video. If not, you're in for a ride because this iceberg goes deep. When you start the game, you are the center focus. There's a lot around you, and so Stray is silhouetted in a bright center. You know that character right here is you. There's no lock on, no outline around you. The game itself, the environmental effects, does that for you. And you'll notice a correlation with this throughout the video, where the interface is actually the world. But here's where you'll notice how refined the UI is. You see that? It's right there the second you start the game. It's the one thing that's not part of the environment. So you know this is a prompt. When you get closer, the game shows an icon based on the controller you're using. They could have used that icon in the first place, but it would break that immersion. When you press it, you interact with the little black cat. When you go to the next cat, you'll notice the same icon, but a different interaction. And finally, with the last cat, another different interaction. The game is showing you context-sensitive buttons. Basically, one button does multiple things when you need it to. This is your initial tutorial into the interface, and this is about 95% it. The other 5% is where you interact with the small drone, B12, but we'll get into that in a bit. Let's first talk about what UI and UX are, because they're very different but rely on each other to function effectively. UI is short for user interface. That's all these on the screen, but before these are even created, there's UX, or user experience. It's usually mapped out. Basically think of it like a flow chart. When you press the menu button, there's a lot of things going on when you actually press that button. You have multiple paths to travel, enter and exit points, and you need UI to immerse you in that element. That's where the rules for user interface comes in. For one, the user interface needs to be responsive. Let's go back to Stray. The interface is extremely fluid. Before you reach a context-sensitive area, the game shows you through the circle that there's something you can interact with. It doesn't show you text, it doesn't show you an icon to let you know what type of interaction it is. Instead, you just know there's an interaction. Once you get closer, then you're shown the button prompt. And since the game is so self-contained, once you get a few minutes into it, you'll know what those circles mean without a complicated text interface. This is fluid design. This is responsive. The UI should always have intention. It should always help lead you through the path or a puzzle. Stray does this multiple ways. For one, the game world itself is designed to lead you through leading lines, colors, and lights. And you can see this right from the beginning. When you're in the cavern, there are these leading lines pointing you in the right direction. The game also uses light as a map. When you first enter the sewers, you see lights guiding you down a dark path, and when you leave the path, you see a green light down a long path with leading lines on either side. That green light is your waypoint, and those leading lines is your breadcrumb trail. It also uses environmental colors to show you various things like danger or an intermission area and a sort of hub area, to the point where if I saw a drab color and a red light coming up, I knew there was some kind of action section I was about to enter. Since the UI and gameplay are so simple, the context-sensitive buttons and icons play multiple roles. Not only does it show you something you can interact with, but where you can go. Stray can jump off ledges and platforms, drink water, and scratch. The UI is aware of where you are and what you need to do flawlessly. This makes it so you don't have to worry about pressing different buttons, multiple buttons, or take a nap when you meant to jump. There are two types of UI elements in the game: your own interactions and interactions with other entities like the companions. When you interact with them, it's almost exclusively through B12, but it follows that throughout the game. It's consistent. When you interact with jumping, scratching, or even sleeping, you have a set of button prompts. But that consistency gives different emotions. Just ask anyone who's played the game and came up to this point. This one prompt gave a lot of people so much emotion. And let's be clear here, this is just a button prompt. But through the game's story, through the game's environment, it uses this prompt to reach out to you and make you part of the game. With the exception of the button prompts, the game's UI is stylized to fit the designs of Stray. B12 uses a holographic interface that matches the surroundings, and you can see that interface fitting within the game's world. But there's also neon signs as guide points to help you navigate the world. Screens literally telling you where to go or what to do. No floating arrows, no dotted lines on the ground. The developers took a lot of time logically designing how waypoints and guides should work in the game's environment. And that's a key thing about this game. The designers built the world to be the interface. It's diegetic, or UI based within the game world, meaning it's total immersion. Sim games do this a lot, but this isn't necessarily a sim game. Now, versus non-diegetics, where the UI is based on the game's fiction, its geometry. Now, we're going to talk a lot about diegetics and non-diegetics, but within this family are a few more types of interfaces. For one, there's meta, which is UI on a 2D plane, but stays within the game's narrative. Think about fighting games. These are basically the same interface. They both tell you how much your life is, they both tell you the stats of the player, they both tell you how much time you have left in the game. But they're designed to fit the game's narrative, its vibe. If you change them for the other game, it would look out of place. Narrative isn't just written words, narrative can be visual as well. Narrative can be the UI elements. And lastly, there's something called special, where the UI sits in the game's geometry, but the character is not aware of it. A lot of these are usually used in tutorials or games like Saints Row, where they use the GPS, but the GPS is built within the game's world, and the characters don't actually see it, only you see it. Stray sticks with the diegetic and non-diegetics, but it uses these two categories complementary to each other. I bet you didn't know about the atmospheric colors letting you know what kind of situation you are in or about to be in. It's not done by mistake and not necessarily done as an artistic interpretation for the game. The developers utilized diegetic design in a very interesting way, and in some ways, the design of Stray was dictated by interface design or lack of the interface. Diegetics is usually used to help immersion in-game. However, not all games benefit from diegetic, or if you try to shoehorn it into a game, it usually doesn't work out right. There was a test done by UCL with Battlefield 3. They had two versions of the game, the regular one we've all played, and one where the UI elements were stripped out and diegetic design was modded into it. The study found that skilled players actually enjoyed the diegetic interface, while unskilled players hated it because they didn't know what to do, and that's because the game wasn't designed for a diegetic interface. There was no way to help new players understand the game's mechanics, because the game was built for prompts and UI elements. Stray was built from the ground up for diegetics. Here's an example. Early on, the developers had a free jump mechanic in the game, but people kept falling and getting frustrated. So the developers started thinking, should Stray have a meter letting you know how far you could jump? Does it need a running jump mechanic? And if so, how do you show speed ramps right before you jump? Instead, they opted to have context-sensitive icons so that the game pretty much jumped for you, and because of that, you don't need added interface. This is also true in the game's combat, which is one of the main negatives most people have about Stray. You have a UV weapon to fight the game's enemies, but eventually it breaks, marking the end of the game's combat altogether. While the game doesn't have a targeting system, it uses diegetics to show you the weapon's area of effect. But then there's a little power meter attached to B12 showing you the ammo or cooldown timer. And here's where I wish designers thought about the interface a little bit more. Instead of having a cooldown meter, which seems very thrown in, I wish it was integrated into the backpack. I understand why the context-sensitive buttons aren't integrated, since you didn't have the backpack in the beginning, but that meter, that little thing right there, truthfully doesn't really break the immersion, but they had a place to put it and they just didn't do it. And yeah, you can argue that it's another holographic image, but it doesn't share the same design as B12's actual projection. This is like my one negative for the UI UX kind of elements of this game. But speaking about B12, he introduces you to the secondary interface for communicating and inventory management. And I use inventory management loosely since there's no real management or figuring out what item to use. Once you get the backpack, it actually houses B12, and you can see him when he's not flying. It also lights up when you do certain things like interact with other companions. The whole interface is projected out of B12, so much so that when he feels bad, the interface doesn't work, and you can see the icons to talk to the companions grayed out. B12 is basically your submenu. He is your text box and inventory menu system. But instead of navigating through multiple windows and button prompts, it's represented by a drone and a holographic display. Now, the one thing B12 or Stray's interface doesn't do is show you where to go. Instead, the world does that for you. The environment is its own waypoint, its own map. Remember when I said in the beginning of the game how it uses lights and signs to show you the way? When you look at the game's world, you start to realize forward isn't always the most direct or correct path. Just look at this area. At any given moment, you can go to all these locations, but you might go here. That's because you see a light, you see a sign. Since the start of the game, you're trained to see this as a waypoint. It might seem like simple mechanics, but I assure you, this is days or weeks of designing, iterating on the design, and testing to make this seem so simple to users. I've always said this before, but the best kind of design is the one you don't realize has design. The lack of UI also keeps you immersed in the game. Here's a scene of Stray walking down a path. It's breathtaking. It shows you scale, soundscape, and environmental effects. It's immersive. But now, let's put an interface on it. Now you're looking at a mini-map. You're looking at the icons you can interact with. You're not enjoying the world. You're looking for your next objective. And I'm 100% sure finding your next objective was the last thing developers wanted you to prioritize. I mean, you can just straight up sleep in the game. The developers wanted you to enjoy the world. They wanted you to be a future cat. The argument most people make about this game is that it's too simple. It's so simple, it's not really a game. But I argue it's a game with a lot of mechanics. I mean, it's a simulator, it's a point-and-click adventure, it's a puzzle game, an action game all in one. It gives off the appearance of being simple because the interface design is minimal. But that's because it's fluid. There's a minimal chance that you're going to die, get stuck, but that's by design. The developers wanted you to experience the story, enjoy the world, and understand the game's mechanics. They didn't want bad UI design to get in the way of you enjoying the game. And think about all the ways you can play the game, all the ways you could get lost, or not know what your next objective is, and then look at how people play the game. The game's world was designed around the UI, and UI complements the mechanics of the game. Stray is a masterpiece on how to integrate UI and UX elements throughout the game world itself. They also know when to use traditional UI elements, but use them in a way that won't break the game's immersion. Just like another game I spoke about in the beginning of this video, and now we get to the ending. So here's how Stray is so close to Dead Space. For one, they both have indicators on your back. While Stray doesn't have a life bar, the backpack shows you icons with things you interact with or can interact with. They also utilize holographic projectors to show traditional interface items like inventory, but the game's world is always around you. And both games took out any type of HUD elements to give you more immersion. Dead Space is a great suspenseful horror game, and that's because you don't have a minimap, you don't have a traditional life bar or ammo counter. Just like Stray, the developers wanted you to enjoy the game. They wanted you to lose yourself in the game's world, not be tied down by looking at displays, icons, or little dots representing you and enemies on a map in the corner of the screen. And I think that's why people really like Stray. You are the cat. You are learning about the companions, what happened to the people, and how you can get home. And because the UI didn't get in the way of the game, this one scene, this final button prompt, became so emotional. The developers built a game that is easy to pick up, a game that's quick to understand, and a game that doesn't need all that chrome to understand what's going on. And it wasn't by mistake. It's not because the game is so simple, it's because of strategy, testing, and designing. It always comes back to the design. So let me know what you think. Have you played Stray? How hard was the game, or did you just enjoy the world, the story, the meows? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.